Hi everyone, welcome to our latest edition of the Halftime Club, where we'll be speaking about developing technique. I think this is a really big topic, I think, because it's a word we use, technique, all the time in our coaching. And hopefully what we'll do today is take a little bit of a deeper dive into what technique is and what it might not be as well. And also we'll break down some misconceptions about technique in terms of what it actually means in terms of practice design, and I guess how we can more effectively help our players to improve the technical aspect of their game when we coach them. So as usual, we have a little bit of a workshop breakdown. So in general, sort of the main headings of the workshop today will be around what is technique, breaking down technique and the meaning behind it. We'll speak about variability within technique and why it always exists, being wary of technical models, technical boundaries, technique and the practice spectrum, and then some final considerations when coaching. So I guess first of all, to start off today's webinar, what we'll do is open up the floor to those through the Q&A function. What is technique? So just provide your own definitions of it, your own versions of it. Just put it in the Q&A function, which should you find at the top of the screen should be a little question mark in two speech bubbles. Alternatively, you can use the chat function as well, and I'll pick it up there. So yeah, so what is technique? So David shared the way in which something is executed. Thanks, David. Stuart said a set of movements with or without the ball. So only two people responded so far. That's fine if you can't respond. So in terms of, I think in terms of David's definition as well, I think that way in which something is executed is probably the most likely version that we'd understand and we'd say to our players how you execute something. And I think that's really key to understand that execution is generally based on, if those on the previous webinar, is based on our perception of the outcome of something. So what we're going to do, we're going to break that term a little bit down a little bit further, and hopefully we'll start to, break down some misconceptions around the idea of technique. So if you were to search technique for the dictionary, you'd probably get some multiple different definitions. However, the most familiar one, and the one that comes up quite a lot, is it's a way of carrying out a particular task, especially the execution or the performance of it. And I think it's really key to highlight performance as well, because when we speak about the game of football, we are generally observing technical actions within the game or within training. So they are performing in an environment, and then we're judging what they do with that. And it's really important to say it's a way of carrying out a particular task, it isn't the way. And what I mean by that is you'll probably see players that have different techniques and hold different things aligned to some of the technical actions that are required in the game of football. So in attack, that's things like the techniques of passing, the technique of finishing, the technique to receive, moving with the ball, so that's travelling and then turning as well. And it even goes for things off the ball, so our defensive actions around intercepting, what is the technique for intercepting, pressing, marking, challenging the ball, and also covering and recovering. Also had Mark shared, he sees technique as the ability and precision that a player can undertake a skill such as passing, receiving. Raman shared that mechanics of an action, which I think, yeah, again, that links to execution, how you pass, shoot, or tackle. So really good. Thanks, everyone. So I guess now what I want to do is highlight there can be a little bit of a blurred line between two definitions that are often used in the game of football. Now, those that may have been on the UEFA C courses may have spoken about the difference between technique and skill, but from a more academic perspective, actually they're a little bit closer in line. So I want to ask everyone, what do you understand the difference is between technique and skill? So is there a difference between them? And if so, what do you understand it to be? So Gavin shared that technique is how you perform an action, skill is what actions you're capable of performing. So in his mind, that's what he thinks the definitions are, and if there's a difference between them. Clinton shared technique equals how, skill is the level / ability, and put question marks. David shared technique could be the way a player turns. For example, Zidane, a skillful player, could relate to more reading the game. And the ability to make decisions when to be technical. So we're saying skillful is more relating to something and technique's more the how. Yeah, thanks, Clinton. So Clinton's also shared about skill might be closer to the desired outcome. So if I sort of look at some of the responses, I think we often use similar descriptions to define both things. So what I mean by that is we say like technique is how we might perform something, but we also say skill is also the performance as well of the technique. Um, some of you may be familiar with sort of skill being defined as, you know, where, when, and what timing you do it, and in the environment you're probably looking to perform within, and the technique being like definitively the how bit. However, what we're going to look at in a moment is actually they're probably a lot closer aligned than we think, and actually if we understand it better, we actually are going to be more impactful with our interventions on the match day. So it's him here, Stuart, saying about your actions in an opposed environment. So generally we say about technique is something that doesn't occur opposed, but actually we're going to look at that and probably break that down. So cheers, everyone. So the first thing we're going to look at is variability. And the reason we're going to look at this is sometimes when we speak about technique, technique can often mean something that's well defined. So it's a way of doing something like we spoke about earlier. And I want you to introduce you to an individual called Nikolai Bernstein and his paradox of the hammer. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea about variability always exists. So this individual was concerned with the number of muscles and joints that we would need to coordinate when we move. So think about when we strike a football, when we throw something, when we run and jump. So he looks at the body and thinks, right, there's so many muscles, there's so many joints, but we need to somehow coordinate all them. So he was thinking about how many limbs, how many muscles, how many joints are involved in certain actions, and where they are involved. Now, he done a lot of studies, and this picture hopefully highlights this, that he found no movement was ever the same, even if the task goal was similar. So what he means by that is most of the things we do share similar angles and a similar approach, but the ranges of motion we use, the speed in which we do it, where the muscles are fired might differ every single time. And hopefully that image highlights here, he's hammering a nail into a piece of wood, but the path that which the hand takes differs every single time, yet the outcome of hitting the nail is exactly the same every time. So hopefully when we say about technique, there isn't just one single way to do it. There's lots and lots of variation that happens in every single movement you do, which is inherent to our body, because our body's dynamic. It's full of lots of joints and muscles and nerves and things like that, which inform how we move. So this thing links into sort of the idea of technical models. And we'll look at a little bit of analogy around golf a bit further on, just as a little bit of a difference in terms of football to try and understand the topic a bit more. But sometimes we have this idea of a technical model, so a way of executing something. So sometimes we think about a knuckleball, for example, we think about a way of passing. We think there are very defined rules how we do it. So it might be you have to do it this way to get success. So that sometimes then lends itself to believing that technique holds little variation, but as we just spoke about, every action you do varies every single time. There's an infinite amount of ways to move. So we may then think there's an ideal technical model that exists, and it is often one that we chase. And as coaches, sometimes we think it's the holy grail. Sometimes we chase after that as a coach, and we aim for our players to be brilliant at a certain way of doing something. But if variability always exists, as we discussed, even for the same task, and surely a technical model contradicts what actually happens in real life. So we don't want to be wed to models. We want to be wed to the idea that there's variability and it's always there, and we might not be able to always control that. So as promised, we're going to look at golf. So some of you may play golf, some of you might not. And there's been a lot of research and studies around some professional golfers and their swings and the type of swing, and what the people have been trying to do over the years is work out what they do and can we copy what they do, so then we could become really good at our golf swing, for example. So at the top right of the page now, you should see a 6 golfers who are all different in nature, and they have 6 different golf swings, but when this study was produced, they all had 6 effective outcomes, so they all got the ball into the desired target area. So when we look at these individual golfers, we know they have different golf swings, but research in the past, what they did, and this is why technical models might not be the most effective way to look at technique, is they averaged out and collated all of these swings together, because in their belief, if we can produce the best swing and the best technique, we need to then get everyone else's swing, put it together in one, and surely that would be the best model. But what they then didn't understand and didn't take consideration is as soon as you do that, you lose individual nuance that makes each person's style unique to them. So what I mean by that, for example, is each of these golfers may have different arm lengths, may have different muscles that fire a different tension, different mobility around their joints. Therefore, if we average people out to try and get the best technique, it actually becomes really then hard to then prescribe the same technical model for every player, because every player is unique. So this doesn't though mean, by the way, that technique doesn't exist. What we're trying to say is that what everyone does, everyone's technique is based on their own capabilities and what they can and can't do. What we shouldn't do is look at 20 different people, average them out and say, well, that must be the best way of doing it, because no, it's their way of doing it. And that's what we need to understand. So that then comes towards this. If there was an ideal technique that could be copied and pasted, then surely everyone would be world class. Because surely what we do is say, you do this and you're going to become at this level. But we know that doesn't happen. So technique is not something that can be copied and pasted from other people. They have unique constraints, individual things which support them to do what they do in a certain way. However, I think this is really key, there are movement boundaries. We spoke about technical boundaries in the sort of breakdown of the workshop today. So what I mean by that is, to swing a golf club, to hit a golf ball, I probably need to swing in a rough way that allows me to hit the ball. There may be some nuance within that. For example, I'm probably not going to be able to swing it over my head, one arm, and through my legs. There has to be some sort of basic sort of pattern that we have to follow, or form that we have to follow. So what we want to get into the idea of, all techniques must follow some sort of optimal or minimal principles to be effective. Otherwise, the quality of the outcome would differ so wildly and the range would be so big that the outcome would be really poor. So we need to understand what fundamentally needs to exist to be effective at a certain technique, whilst understanding that we cannot fully control the exact of every movement. So this brings us to our next question. So this goes out to the room. So what fundamentals must exist for a player to kick the ball upwards from the floor? So I want to get the ball up from the floor. What are the fundamentals required so the ball travels upwards? So just have a little think, put it in the Q&A, and think about all the sort of maybe technical details that you might have said in the past to help players with that. So Clinton said about limb movement and coordination. So that's not wrong, Clinton. It's quite broad. So we speak about the really specific, what fundamentally must happen between the person and the ball for it to go up. So Jay said about contact below the ball and follow through the leg as an example. Gavin said must strike the bottom of the ball, lean back, use the toe of the foot. David said body position part of the foot used, power. Position the foot on the ball. Rama said how they angle their foot, the force they use. David said about leaning back, getting foot under the ball. Stuart said, yeah, lean back slightly, foot striking underneath the centre of the ball, approach the ball at a slight angle, follow through across your body. Jack said, strike the ball low, use more power, lean back, use small contact area. Mark said, strike the bottom half of the ball, lean back slightly, standing, foot slightly behind. Thanks, everyone. So there's some similar things here. So I think one of the main ones is definitely we've got to strike below the half, the bottom half of the ball. So I think that's really important. Now, the other bits about leaning back and that I think are really interesting, because as we're going to speak about in the moment, that's actually not a fundamental thing to get the ball up. Okay, but leaning back might be fundamental towards something else. Where our standing foot again might not necessarily be fundamental to kicking the ball upwards in the air. So just something to think about and hold on to. So boundaries are important. So we must seek to understand what minimum movement principles are required. The rest is either opinion, preference from your own experiences of what you've been told, or it's highly contextual depending on what outcome you're trying to achieve. If we define what the minimum is, then we are better placed to be more impactful with our interventions. So for example, if I use the example of shooting, when we try to support a player developing that shooting action, coaches will often assess the technique of this individual aligned to maybe what they see the player doing, what they expect should happen for a successful attempt to emerge. And probably some of that perception, again, is based on your prior experience, what you've been taught. And the larger the gap between the two things that you're seeing and what you know or think to be correct, is probably you're more likely to say that person is being less technically effective. And what we're now going to say is actually we can probably move quite far away from that now and just say what needs to happen, for example, for the ball in our example to go upwards. So we're going to look at the foot in a variety of ways. We're going to break down all the options available, all the different parts of surfaces, etc., that we might use to try and get the ball up in the air. So we're going to look at the foot as a paintbrush, and the reason I call it a paintbrush is because you've got different strokes with a paintbrush. So you can go up, you can down, you can go soft, you can go hard, but we're going to look at it in terms of a variety of surfaces. So when we think about the football boot or foot in general, you've got the inside of the foot, you've got the sole of the foot, you've got the inside toe, the front toe, back of the heel, outside laces, instep, outside of the toe. Now, obviously, the sole of the foot might be hard to get the ball up in the air with, but all the other surfaces can be used to get the ball upwards as long as we strike underneath the ball. So the basic principle of the ball going up is we need to provide lift, and to provide lift, we have to apply force from underneath the ball. And we can use all these different surfaces to achieve that. Now, that's just one example. We can also look at the foot from the side. Our foot can remain flat on the floor, and we can use the natural curve of the front toe to the sort of the bony bit at the top of the foot as like a ramp for the ball to go up. So that's just another way the ball can be lifted. We can raise our heel up so we get more of an angle. Obviously, if you open, I use the word open mouth, so you lift your toe up at the front. Obviously, it'd be difficult to raise the ball, lift the ball upwards because our toes high up in the air. We haven't got that ability to lift it up. And obviously, if we lift the foot completely off the floor, then we won't make contact underneath the ball. If we look at it from the front, and some of you may do this already without even realize it, sometimes you might roll your ankle outwards and you get your sort of your inside of your foot lifted up a little bit. So when the ball comes to you, you can flick it up in the air. Okay, when you strike the ball, you might have to angle it slightly to get underneath the ball like that, as an example. And we can also look at it from the top as well. So we can have it straight ahead, we can rotate out, we can rotate in. So hopefully what I'm highlighting is, in the case the example of lifting the ball upwards, in its simplest form, getting the ball underneath, getting your foot underneath the ball is probably going to go up in the air. The other stuff becomes preference depending on the context. So if I want to increase the power, then I probably need to increase my leg swing. I probably need to separate my hips and my shoulders as I strike through the ball. My arms probably need to be involved to generate more power. But when it comes to simply lifting the ball up in the air and getting it upwards, I just need to get my foot under the ball. So hopefully now what we're starting to do is just get rid of the other stuff that might not be as important immediately until the context changes. So the minimum movement principle for getting the ball in the air is your foot must get under the ball. That's the minimum. So when it comes down to technique, really all it is coordination. It's coordinating your body, your muscles, your joints to interact with something. Now, previously we spoke about skill being the application of technique. But if we look at technique as coordination instead, actually we begin to see a lot more. And what I mean by that is, if I'm an individual player, for example, that falls over the ball a lot, and I can't manipulate the ball very effectively, then there's an issue with my coordination in relation to my own body and the ball. Okay, so people might say like ball mastery, or you become familiar with the ball. Vice versa, if I'm in a game and I know I can do that technique, for example, but I'm struggling to coordinate with other people and other things that are going on, like my teammates, the opposition, etc., it's still technique, but in a different context. So it's still all about what am I coordinating to, and am I effectively coordinating to the right information. So what we're now going to do is provide some scenarios based on the practice spectrum, which I'll go through in a moment, that I'd like you to start thinking about. And because often with the practice spectrum, we think about technique as being developed generally in unopposed environments, but actually it can be developed in any environment depending on how you want to focus on it. So the practice spectrum changes and it ebbs and flows and how it's delivered. And I think this practice I'm showing here is from a lot of older courses. However, I think it summarizes a lot more in terms of understanding. So some that have done recent courses might be familiar with sort of match up, outnumbered, interference, all the things like this. And this is just a different way of looking at it, but we're looking at it from more of a coordination and technical development perspective. So I'm just going to go through it. So you'll see the terms in red which say constant, variable, and random. Now, something that's constant just means you're repeating the same task over and over again. Something variable means you've got maybe different tasks happening at different times. And random means you're not entirely sure what order the tasks will happen. So for example, a game is random because the technique, if you're doing passing, for example, every pass might be very different. In a constant practice, the same task is happening, the passes might be a bit more familiar. So it's just something to consider. The low and the high bit in the bottom left to the top right, it's like the arrow, just shows like, lower challenge, low interference, probably lower challenge, probably maybe higher success. When you go up to the higher thing, you've got higher challenge, higher interference. So you're expecting more things to be more challenging, more complex, more information to interact with. So, and you'll also notice the example shown on this spectrum is around practicing a turn, and then we've got practicing turning, and we've got practicing turning again in the random section. So generally a constant practice is there to remind players and provide them opportunities to repeat a constant behavior. That's where that constant comes in. So it's the same behavior over and over again in an environment where they're getting the same opportunities, bam, 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 bam. Random, the opportunities might become less. They might not happen as often, but when they do happen, obviously we're looking to refine it in a different way. So the higher we go up the scale, the more choices and decisions and problem solving the players probably have to contend with. The lower we go down the scale, the probably more simple it is for the players to interact with there. So hopefully the practice spectrum in this way supports an understanding when we may want to select a certain type of practice to develop certain techniques. However, we should never start with a practice in mind. Otherwise, everything we then think about will only align into fitting into this practice. So I want you to imagine the analogy of you've got 45 biscuits and you've got a small biscuit box that you need to get them in and they don't fit. So you end up smashing them and crushing them in just to get them in the box and you put the lid on. Actually, you're forcing everything into that box and that container. Well, we probably need to change the container if we want to retain the quality of them biscuits, for example. So as coaches, especially when we're starting out new, sometimes it's really easy to pick a practice and force all your players' needs into that one practice and hope it sticks. Actually, what we're saying is start with the players in mind, start with their needs, find a practice that brings their needs to life. So hopefully we're now going to bring that a little bit to life with some scenarios. So scenario 1, so player A struggles to pass the ball. They often lose balance when kicking it and always lack the ability to generate power. They struggle in games. So using the practice spectrum, what practice may best suit this individual based on their needs? So we're not starting with the practice first, we're starting with the player's needs. So use the Q&A function. And by the way, there could be varying answers to this and that's not a problem, but start to think about they struggle to pass, they lose balance when they kick it, and they lack the ability to generate power. What practice may best suit individual, and then can you explain why as well? Why have you decided to pick that sort of practice? So remember, always think about the why. So if you've done something, think about the why. So Clinton shared about constant, so opportunity to have one-to-one coaching, focus on technique. Gavin shared about constant because it allows to get the technique right before moving on to more complex scenarios. David shared a constant for the repetitive and success of the needs of the players. I think that's really important when we speak about a constant practice. We're also considering the confidence of the player. Jack shared about constant because unopposed area for them to develop them foundational physical skills like the balance, coordination, striking power, moving up to variable later to challenge them more once these foundation skills are there. Mark shared around constant because and possibly variable as well because they need to build some confidence and they need the time to think. Yeah, and I think that's really important. Sometimes we always have this decision in our head, like, do we put them in more challenging scenarios? And we think, oh, if it's challenging them, they'll learn better. But if they're falling over, for example, they're losing balance and they struggle in games, all you're doing is putting them in a scenario where they're essentially feeling worse about what they can't do. So we have to all take this into consideration. Technique isn't just in isolation. It's you're coordinating to something, you're coordinating to your peers, your teammates. So for example, if they're sort of laughing at you, for example, because you keep falling over, that's not going to make you want to practice what you need to. So a constant practice or variable practice might allow you to increase the success of this player, not worry about the consequence of it, and actually they're more likely then to engage in that process of learning, knowing that further down the line they'll get better. Jay said about maybe a few weeks of constant and gradually some simple variable for a few weeks to start simple and progress from there. Yeah, Clint said about creating distance between players to help increase the power. So yeah, so I think it's really key, first of all, again, there's no right or wrong, but I want you to really start to think about the needs of that player in that moment. If they're falling over in the game, well, guess what? That complexity of the game is probably not the best environment from them right now until they build up a base of confidence and a base of coordination to support them to get success in their moments. So next scenario, so scenario 2. Player B can pass the ball well, but sometimes struggles to slide a pass in behind the opponent. What practice, so using the practice spectrum, may best suit this individual, and then give a reason why. And this, again, it could be as broad as you want it to be. But player B can pass the ball well, but sometimes struggle to slide a pass in behind the opponent. So it's about variable and random to observe progress. So think about what are we trying to observe. So based on that brief, if you pick variable and random, why and what are we trying to observe to find it? Same for David. So if we give an opportunity to focus on the player's needs, why is variable maybe more suitable for this player than constant, for example? What are we actually looking for based on that brief? What needs to be present within the practice based on that brief to allow us to work at the technical side in which we've decided to observe they need help with. So yeah, so brilliant, Gavin. So Gavin said the random, because his opinion, there needs to be the opportunities for the behind passes, which might only come through a practice with greater numbers. So if we're saying he can pass well, this individual, but they sometimes struggle to slide a pass in behind the opponent, well, we probably need opponents in the practice. There probably needs to be space in behind to have the opportunity to do that. And that probably might come from having more players on my team and more players on the other team. So that probably lends itself towards a random practice. Doesn't mean that is the only way, but your rationale there's really clear. So David said about randoms that we can use constraints opposition to create the conditions for player B to practice a slide pass. Yeah, brilliant. So them things need to be present because that's what we're coordinating against. So we spoke about technique earlier, about the how. Well, it's also the how in this situation. We need to, how do we do it with opponents? How do we do it with spacing behind? Stuart shared variable, unopposed benefit to help develop and understand. Yes, it could be you're highlighting, you're getting them to pay attention to, well, this pass might be on in this situation like that. And it might be in a really simple manner of variable practice where there's slightly different options for them, but it's a bit more controlled. And then you might progress to random with individual targets. So yeah, again, really good rationale there. So David should variables opposed, but at the same time, probably more chance of success, than in a random. So again, if you feel you need to just get them a little bit of success at sliding them, passing in different ways, a variable might be a really good way of doing it. When we go into that random, like I said, the opportunities to do that might be less. So Mark said, it sounds like the player has the ability, but needs to focus on the particular scenario. This could be the player's challenge for a random game. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, it's really good that on the brief, it's quite clear that they can pass the ball well. So using, like I said, the terminology we're using, that coordination with the ball and their feet is probably quite effective at the moment, but actually it's not effective once they start coordinating to other things. So we probably need to put them in that situation to get better at it and highlight it. Right, thanks all. So moving on to scenario 3. So player C can pass a ball in straight lines, but struggles to change the angle when pressure is on. They struggle in a game unless they have time on the ball. What practice, using the practice spectrum, may best suit this individual, and then provide your rationale and reasoning as well. So David said variable to provide the opportunity to practice the desired outcome with interference and opposition, then set the targets and put them into the random. So yeah, so that variable, that little bit of interference, might just be enough to challenge them without letting them struggle too much. So it's something to consider. So that little bit of interference in that variable practice might just provide them the different angles we're looking for without being under too much pressure. David thought about variable to practice under low opposition pressure, progress to random to get game conditions. Gavin said variable controlled environment, which is applying enough pressure to release the ball at a different angle, opportunity to demonstrate off-ball movement. Yeah, so you're just adding that little bit on top of, so we know they can do some little bits well, but they're not quite ready for the chaos and complexity of the game yet. So we're just probably staying in that middle of the road sort of variable, a little bit of interference, make sure they've got opportunities to practice things and get a bit of success. Mark said some constant practice passing in different ways. Yes, it might be that because we said about in the brief that passing the ball in a straight line but struggles to change the angle, that might be what we might need to do, is give them experience of maybe using different surfaces, getting different body shapes, and then some variable work under time pressure and build that confidence. Yeah, 100%. So by the way, obviously this is a really simplistic context I'm providing you here. So there can be so much different variations to your answers. I think the key thing is when you go and coach in your own setting, you will observe and you will see things and patterns of behaviours that your players do. The key thing is going, right, so if I know they can do this, they can pass the ball well, for example, but when I watch them in a game, they struggle to execute it in a way which is effective, then I probably need to recreate a slice of that moment so they gives them an opportunity to get better when they go back into it. Often we go, oh, they're not passing effective in the game, so we go all the way back to a constant practice because we think that's what technique is, but actually they can already do that. So all I'm doing is refining what they can already do. What I need to do is start nudging their learning along and select a practice within that spectrum that has a positive impact on them without ruining their confidence, for example. So it's going right, not too hard and not too easy. I might find that middle of the road variable practice might be the one for that player. It might be that they're really effective across them different scales, and it's just a case of paying attention to the right things. So that's why I use the word coordination. I think it's a much better way to understand the needs of players rather than rely on technique to have all the answers for us. So if we're better at observations at coaches, we're going to probably better understand where they struggle and where they need help. Cheers all. So Stuart shared variable with unopposed interference in the practice will allow them to practice with other players on the pitch, but also allow them to have the time to master the element they're struggling with. And concept may also be worth considering practicing open up their body shape. Yeah, 100%. So again, a lot of nuance, but we're now starting to think about when and why I use stuff. And we don't always have to go from constant variable to random, by the way. We can always start a practice at variable, go back to constant, go to random. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It just depends on what we want to achieve. So when it comes to building a session, so there's so many ways we can do it to help technique, but I think if you want to increase, for example, the challenge of a practice, and we spoke about before with the step framework and model, you may want to decrease the space. But if I want to increase the success a player has, I might actually want to increase the space. And I think it's really important because sometimes, and we're going to go through these words: include, exclude, and manipulate. Sometimes when we do a practice, we either work up to the game or we go lower from it. Very rarely do we go and exaggerate past the game. Do we increase the space so it's more than what they'll see on a match day? So how we manipulate, what we include and what we exclude is really important within these frameworks. So if I want someone to get calmer with their first touch, I probably want to increase the space before a defender comes and presses them. So that could be in a variable practice, that could be in a random practice as well. Also, think about the task you set. I may want to include a certain task but exclude others because that's too much information for them. So if we said about that player that was struggling to slide a pass behind the opponent, I might want to include the task. Can you consider when to play in behind? Can you get your striker to run in behind to allow that option to happen? And I might exclude other parts of the game. So I might take away the other stuff, which is defensive responsibility. I might take that away. I might take away consequence if you lose the ball, because I want them to get better at practicing that specific task. The equipment I use as well, using different size goals. If I want to give people more success, I might increase the size of the goal, especially if you're working at finishing, for example. If I want to make it more challenging, I might decrease the size of the goal. And then the people, so where I position players and how I speak to them and how I use them on the pitch will be really important. So I guess sort of some final consideration when coaching is slightly different from previous webinars. So I think be careful with being locked into technical models. So sometimes you might read or see something online, you think that's the way to execute something, and actually it's not. But there are going to be some boundaries to that. The role of the goalkeeper. So techniques are different for the goalkeeper, of course, but the same thinking applies. So I'm sure when Kasper Schmeichel, he's got different ways of catching it. You had David De Gea that saved with his feet. The outcome's still effective in different ways, but we just got to think, is there some fundamental minimal principles that need to exist, or am I just trying to copy and paste what I saw someone else do? Let players explore, guide their attention to recognising details, and that links into, again, we speak about coordination. If I can pass the ball well in an unopposed environment, but I'm struggling in an opposed one, then I probably need to help nudge their learning towards what information, what I want to pay attention to. Always provide encouragement. I think when we speak about developing technique, sometimes we can rush through a practice, and it's hard, to try something new. And it's hard to feel confident trying something new. So sometimes just be willing to be patient, provide encouragement, understand that no player goes out there to deliberately make a mistake, and have fun trying these things as a coach. So hopefully this has provided you some insight into what technique might be, what it might not include, and you're now going to go out there as a coach and try and impact on these things. So in terms of a workshop summary, so technique and skill are very similar definitions. Because we have to think to ourselves, when does technique become a skill? Is it simply when we go up to a different practice, or is it simply when we put opposition in? And it's probably neither. Variability exists at all levels. Technical models can restrict how we coach and what we observe, so be careful about them. There is no perfect technique. There's only optimal minimal principles that probably need to be followed to get a certain outcome. Like we said, if you want to get the ball up, you probably need to hit under the ball. That's probably the minimum. The other bits may be a bit fluffy. Copy and paste techniques may not support individual differences, different heights, different body shapes, different speeds, so be careful of that. It's all to do with coordination. Think about the practice spectrum as well, we highlighted, and discover the context in which the techniques occur. So if we see someone struggle in a certain environment, don't think you've got to go all the way back to the bottom of the spectrum to coach it. It might be you just need to lower some of the information they interact with. So it might be lower the interference. Include, exclude, and manipulate. And then the step framework. So thanks everyone for joining. I just guess finally, hope this should provide a little bit of excitement as well towards breaking these things down, which we speak about on a regular basis. And I think one of these things we've got coming up is around developing the physical corner, and we've got a webinar that's coming up, and there will be practical workshops that follow this, where we start speaking about the physical requirements of the game, but from a coaching and football perspective. It's not heavy science. This is about what movements allow us to get better at playing football with and without the ball. So what underpins the game, and what can we do to bring this stuff to life. And I think it's a really good one, because when we speak about physical stuff, it normally means fitness, but we're going to look at a bit more detail. And for those of you that haven't been able to get on the UAFC, for example, or interested in going to the UAFC going forwards, we do have a looking towards the UAFC practical workshop that's coming up on the 22nd of April. And it's going to a little insight into some of the content that you would see on the UAFC. So hopefully it then provides you that backdrop that when you do or when you are successful in your application at some stage, that you feel ready and competent on the course, and you can get the best out of these courses. So that's all on our SXFA website, should you want to see it and book on. So I guess thanks for joining. Our next workshop will be on Friday the 19th of April around developing tactical understanding. And hopefully I'll see you there, and I'll send out notifications to those that have signed up as well. Any questions, I'll be on for the next sort of 15 minutes or so. So please fire them across, and I'll do my best to support as always. Cheers, everyone.